introduction, I already have the mic. What you have not told me is how long you want me to speak for. As long as I can is a vague expression, because normally when I am listening, certainly I tend to lose interest after about 30 minutes. So what I propose to do is to talk for about 30 minutes or thereabouts. That does not mean that the discussion ends at 30 minutes. After that, hopefully we can interact. I'm sure you will have questions. So that's what we will do. Again, thanks for inviting me. This had been scheduled earlier. It had to be rescheduled, and finally it's happening today. And as the introduction mentioned, I'm probably partly here, if not entirely here, because of the book that I wrote on Gujarat. What I will do in the next 30 minutes or however long we are here is not book to do a substitute product for that book, because that book is a longish book. Instead, I will approach the issue somewhat differently. And when I say approach the issue somewhat differently, let me begin with an anecdote. And that anecdote was one of the triggers for my having decided to write a book on Gujarat. So let me begin with that anecdote. And the anecdote was the following. I had no intention of writing a book on Gujarat. Partly because of what was mentioned, my historical disassociation from the Rajiv Gandhi Institute because of something that I had done on Gujarat. It was not quite the case that I was falling over backwards wanting to do a book on Gujarat. However, my wife and I, we decided to take a vacation in Gujarat. And this vacation in Gujarat involved traveling to Kutch. I don't know how many of you are from Gujarat, if any are from Gujarat, but Kutch is where habitation, or this part of Kutch is where habitation ends. This is the border area with Pakistan, and there is a remote village there named Dodo. Dodo is the last inhabited village before the desolate stretch of Kutch begins, and that goes all the way to Pakistan. And we went to visit the Gram Pradhan. And the Gram Pradhan proudly showed us that the entire village had been lit up with solar power. It's not that solar power provided all the electricity, there were regular lights also. But the entire village had also been lit up with solar power. And I asked this Pradhan, do you have children? And mind you, this particular Pradhan is not, he may be aware, but certainly formally, he is not very educated. He said he had 2 daughters and they were studying in Bhuj. I said, what do you want your daughters to do? The daughters were still in school. And he said, I want my daughters to become computer engineers. Which was, to say the least, a little bit surprising. And there in that village, there was also an ATM run by the SBI. And that ATM operated entirely on solar power. Because many of the villagers were illiterate, it did not actually use PIN numbers, instead it had fingerprint reading. My wife and I, we looked at this and said, we don't believe this. This does not work. It cannot possibly work. Lo and behold, the thing worked. We come from West Bengal. West Bengal is not a state that is doing particularly well. I have extensively travelled in Jharkhand also, again a state that's not doing particularly well. And I began to ask myself, I've seen this in this remote last mile, so to speak, near the border village in Gujarat, in Dodo. Is something like this, solar power in the village, solar-based ATM, a Pradhan who says he wants his daughters to become computer engineers, a village where the Panchayat has decided to, on its own money, to set up 15 resorts run by a professional manager whom the Pradhan went and hired from Singapore. I began to ask myself, is there any other state in India that I can think of where this is likely to happen? And I'm sorry to say, the answer was no. So we came back from that vacation and the seed of that book was planted. The seed of that book was planted and I decided I want to probe the Gujarat story. On the Gujarat story, to my mind, there are three layers. First layer, is there a growth story? Second layer, is there a development story? Third layer, who is responsible for that growth and development story? I'm stressing those three different layers because not very long ago, even 1 year ago, there was a lot of discussion floating around questioning even the growth story. When somewhat reluctantly that growth story began to be accepted, the development story began to be questioned. By the development story, I mean the human development indicator kinds of measures. Even today, that story of development has not completely been accepted. And therefore the third layer of who is responsible for this has almost not been accepted at all. On these three layers, let me make the following points almost in bulleted fashion first. The Gujarat growth story is not about whether growth is 9.16% or 10.17%. I'm not going to give you the figures, you can look up the figures, everyone has access to the figures. But the Gujarat growth story is not about numerical figures on what has been GSDP, gross state domestic product growth. The Gujarat story is about something else, which I will come to later on. Quite often when talking about Gujarat, a proposition is advanced and people have asked me, is what is happening in Gujarat real or is it just hype? And I've never quite understood that. Hype suggests that it is not happening, it has been built up through a media blitz, it's not real. How can you have an expression like hype for a growth figure? The growth figure is a growth figure. It's not being churned out by a PR firm. On that growth figure, and I want to underline this point, this was mentioned in passing in the introduction. The Gujarat growth story is not only about vibrant Gujarat interpreted as corporate sector industry. Of course it's there, but the Gujarat growth story is also about small scale industry. Some of you who dabble in economics may know that it is very difficult to get data on SSI, small scale industry. These days we call it MSME, micro, small and medium enterprises. The data usually surface through censuses which are somewhat unsatisfactory, but they surface at some intervals. And one of the problems with MSMEs is that MSMEs and historically SSIs did not get themselves registered. They did not get themselves registered despite the fact that many of the incentives you got from the government were conditional on registration. So the question to ask is, was that decision not to register, and I'm not talking about Gujarat, it's all over India, is that decision not to register one that is because of ignorance, or is it a conscious decision not to register because the inspectors are going to descend on you? Is it a conscious decision not to register because the procedural costs, the compliance costs of registration are too high? Let me not get into that tangential debate. What I want to mention for you is the fact that there has been a sharp increase in the percentage of SSI which is registered in Gujarat. These SSIs tend to be in certain clusters, of course. So the Gujarat growth story, to repeat, is not just about corporate industry, it's also about the SSI, it's also about the MSMEs, which of course tend to be in certain clusters. Let me also mention that manufacturing share in GDP, those of you who have studied economics will know that manufacturing is not the same as industry. Industry is more than manufacturing. It is not the case that there has been a spectacular improvement in the share of manufacturing in GSDP in Gujarat. No. Gujarat's GSDP has been growing also because of agriculture. It's also growing because of the services sector. And if industry share in GSDP is going up, that's not because the manufacturing share in GSDP is going up dramatically, but because the non-manufacturing industrial components of GSDP, things like electricity, are going up. Next, in bulleted fashion, again, let me mention the agriculture story. Some of which has been talked about, you are aware of some of this. As a country, we are struggling for years to make agriculture grow at 4%. And here is a state where agriculture over a period of more than 10 years has grown at 10% or thereabouts. Question to ask is, what made this happen? What was this magic, if there was some magic, that made this agriculture story happen? Again, in the introduction, she mentioned the reduced volatility in growth. Whichever state in India you are talking about, the volatility of growth is primarily because of what happens or does not happen to agriculture. So the reason the volatility of growth in Gujarat has come down is because of the agriculture story. And what's the agriculture story? To my mind, the agriculture story has four different components. One, roads. Now when I say roads, do realize that compared to many other states in India, roads in Gujarat have always tended to be somewhat better. However, on that base of good roads, there have been improvements Kacha roads have become Pakka roads, so whichever part of Gujarat you go to, North Gujarat is a little bit of an exception, I will come back to that, but otherwise wherever you go to, roads are uniformly good. The second story is the electricity story. And again, the electricity story is something that most people here certainly know about. It is fundamentally a story of bifurcating the agricultural distribution lines so that domestic consumption in the rural sector is still subsidized. However, power in the agricultural sector that is used for purposes of irrigation is metered. It is not metered quite in the sense of it's more like a flat rate. However, it is assured for 8 hours. Now that bifurcation story, the Jyotigram scheme, in the course of which farmers were actually probably the only state where farmers were actually prosecuted and convicted for theft of power. So there's the electricity story. And the third story is the water story. Again, don't get me wrong. The water story is not a Narmada and Sardar Sarovar story. Most of the water that is supposed to come from Narmada and Sardar Sarovar has not even begun to come yet. Only about 35% has come. So what's the water story? The water story is partly a micro waterworks story, by which I mean check dams and things like that. And part of it is the institution of a pipeline that carries water from the surplus areas to the deficit areas. So therefore, in places like Saurashtra and Kutch, which traditionally have been drought prone, in the last few months, of course, Saurashtra and Kutch have also suffered, but are they screaming the way Maharashtra is screaming today? The answer is no. You go to remote parts of Gujarat and you will be told by people, not by the government, by people, that it is very rare to see a water tanker anywhere in Gujarat. Water tankers are in Gujarat. We come back to this development question. It is my conviction that if you can ensure roads, water and electricity for people, everything else happens. Even the education happens. Even the health happens. If you can ensure law and order, roads, electricity and water, did I mention water? Yes. And well, bijli ka pani essentially. If you can ensure that and law and order, every other development follows. What is to me the Gujarat story? I told you, I began by saying that the Gujarat story is not about numbers. So what is the Gujarat story? And this is the Gujarat story the way I see it. This is not quite the Gujarat story that is projected. You will understand why I am saying this in a minute. This is not quite the Gujarat story that is projected even by the Gujarat government. This is not quite the Gujarat story that is even accepted by the BJP in terms of public policy. I hope that this will be the story that will eventually be established and accepted. What are the principles of this? Now you will understand why I said that even the Gujarat government does not quite state it in this way. Proposition number 2. People people who are able-bodied and in the working age groups do not need subsidies. People who are able-bodied and in the working age groups are not voluntarily poor. If you give them the physical infrastructure, the law and order, roads, water, electricity, they will not be poor. No one wants a subsidy. Infants are different. Mothers who are giving birth to children may be different. Old people may be different. Otherwise, do not give people subsidies. Subsidies have opportunity costs. If you are giving people subsidies, that is money that could have been spent on the roads, the water and the electricity. Now this principle you can begin to see happening in Gujarat, so that even poor people are being made to pay notionally through the panchayats for water. I said notionally because they pay 10%. Hopefully they will eventually pay complete user charges. So this is point number one. Point number two, and again you will realize why I said that even the Gujarat government does not say it publicly. Point number two, poverty is an individual household level characteristic. It has nothing to do with collective characteristics like Muslim, SC, ST. You begin to equate the two, you will make mistakes. Because you will include people because of their collective categories who should not be included, and you will exclude people who would otherwise should have been included. Okay. So far as the Gujarat government is concerned, you can see it happening not in terms of what is stated, but you can begin to see the beginnings of this. STs are a bit of an exception in Gujarat even now. Point number three, whether you have a good policy, whether you have a bad policy, that policy will be delivered by the bureaucracy. And the bureaucracy does not mean the All India services. The bureaucracy means going down to the level of the BDO and even further down. If you cannot empower the bureaucracy, if you cannot insulate the bureaucracy from political interference, where a minister rings up and says, I want so and so to be transferred, I want such and such to get such and such a posting. If you cannot ensure that this insulation happens, the bureaucracy will never deliver. If you cannot ensure stability of tenure, the bureaucracy will never deliver. If you cannot ensure cross-fertilization of ideas across the various ministries and departments that government silos operate under, the bureaucracy will not deliver. The Chintan Shivers, for example, which I am sure some of you may have heard of, were phenomenally successful in breaking down these barriers. So if my department was water and yours was health, there was nothing to prevent me from saying that this is what I think should be done. On the bureaucracy, several things have happened. Firstly, there's been this sense of empowerment. Secondly, as I said, the bureaucracy has been politically has been insulated from political interference, and thirdly, the bureaucracy has gone down to the level of the people. Let me give an example of this. I don't know how many of you know that 41 talukas have been identified as backward talukas. And there are 41 secretary level officials. So these 41 secretary level officials have been told each of you is responsible for the development of this backward taluka. You have 5 crores of money to decide what programs, what projects are relevant to improve development in that taluka. It is your responsibility. What's been the result? This was a backward taluka, that one was not a backward taluka, and that was right next door. The upshot of this intervention has been that the backward talukas, the identified backward talukas today, are better off than the talukas that had not been identified as backward. There is a scheme called the Gunotsav scheme, which is for government schools. What happens under the Gunotsav scheme? Under the Gunotsav scheme, ministers and bureaucrats descend on a government school and rate it. Simultaneously, the teachers also grade it. And this has been going on for about 3 years now. In the process, not only is the external evaluation a real one, the ministers and the bureaucrats come closer to people. The decentralization of planning, while it is talked about in Yojana Bhavan, has actually been implemented at least up to the taluka level already in Gujarat. There are plans of taking it down to the level of the village, but certainly down to the level of the taluka it has already happened. Those of you who specialize on agriculture will know that one of the big problems with agriculture in India, particularly since the mid-80s, has been a complete collapse of extension services. Extension services which are delivered by the public sector. Technology may be private sector, certainly BT technology, which has been important for cotton in Gujarat, has been private sector, but extension services have to be public sector. Again, I can give you examples to illustrate how the extension services have been rehabilitated by taking them down. Now, these are the various elements of the Gujarat story which to my mind are much more important than the sheer numbers. Let me mention one final point on this template, which is, I cannot expect the government to do everything. For God's sake, why should it do everything? And the Gujarati, unlike the Bengali, has a healthy skepticism for the government, healthy distrust for the government, which I think has been very good for Gujarat and very bad for Bengal, but let that be. So I don't expect the government to do everything. So let me give an example like the Chiranjeevi Yojana. All over the country we are going nuts, trying to ensure that there are doctors present at the community health centers. Forget the primary health centers. Government doctors are never there. So what does the Chiranjeevi scheme do? The Chiranjeevi scheme essentially says, why should I try to do this at all? What's my objective? My objective is to ensure that the poor can get reimbursed their medical costs. So how does it matter to me whether they are going to a private doctor or to the primary health center? Let me introduce the Chiranjeevi Yojana, which simply means that provided you are one of these recognized doctors, even if you are a private doctor, for this medical treatment, I will reimburse you. Let me now turn to the development part of it. I've talked about the growth part of it. Now the development part of it. On the development part of it, you must appreciate the obvious, which unfortunately many people in Delhi, including in JNU, don't always appreciate. Which is namely, when I'm looking at the social sector, there is a time lag in the data. So before beginning to criticize, let's look at the timeline. So we have a human development report that's published by the Planning Commission and the National Institute of Applied Manpower Research. This comes out in the year 2011. And according to this, in the year 2011, Gujarat does not do that well on human development. Everyone goes to town over it, as they rightly should. But what they should also check is, alright, this human development report has been published in the year 2011. Let's check the timeline for the data. And the timeline for the data, despite it being published in the year 2011, happens to be the year 2004-2005. The National Sample Survey of 2004-2005. So what I certainly do expect is that if someone like Jairam Ramesh, who should have better sense, shoots his mouth off, then he should check the timeline. I don't expect Justice Kharju to check the timeline. Do they do that? They don't. In health and education, do we have subsequent data series? Of course we do. For education, certainly for school education, we have a data series that's called the DICE data, which is brought out by what is now the National University of Education Planning and Administration. Look at the DICE data set. If you look at the DICE data set, you will find, certainly for school education, whatever be the indicator you're talking about, there has been a very, very sharp improvement in Gujarat. Now don't get me wrong, Gujarat has not become Sweden. I don't think any of you also think that Gujarat has become Sweden. So what is important is to check what has been the increment, what has been the incremental improvement. And I'm flagging the word incremental improvement because the conscious focus on social sectors began in Gujarat in the course of the 11th 5-year plan, which is 2007. So the conscious focus on social sectors actually began in 2007. So whether it is successful or is not successful depends on what happened after 2007. So as I said, if you look at the school indicators, find improvements. Health. Why hasn't anyone asked me this question so far? What about malnutrition in Gujarat? Well, what about malnutrition in Gujarat? Who told us there was malnutrition in Gujarat? Well, no one bothers to check. But the people who told us there was malnutrition in Gujarat was the International Food Policy Research Institute, IFPRI, the India division of IFPRI, who did a study. Again, it's not that IFPRI hid it. Trouble is, no one bothers to read anything. The IFPRI data point is again 2004-2005 and the National Health Service survey of 2006-07. Since then, has anyone told us anything about malnutrition? Well, in a way the CET has in its audit report of the ICDS. And what does that show us? Again show us a very, very sharp improvement. If you look at state government data, you find that the institutional delivery has now gone up to about 93%. Now that's phenomenal. One of the reasons it has happened is because of something called the 108 number. So you dial a 108 number, which is an emergency number, and you are whisked off to whatever is the nearest referral hospital. Of course, it's true that Gujarat did not think of 108. It was Andhra Pradesh which thought of 108. The difference, of course, is that Gujarat actually implemented. So actually many of the things that Gujarat has been implementing are things that have been thought of in other states, except they haven't implemented. So what is the Gujarat development template? I don't think there is a Gujarat development template at all. This is a standard development template that should be implemented in every state of the country. It's a different matter that it has not been implemented in every state of the country. Is it rocket science to say that the bureaucracy should be empowered? Is it rocket science to say that the bureaucracy should be insulated from political interference? Is it rocket science to say that given the rigidity of templates under the central sector and centrally sponsored schemes, where by the way, I don't know how many of you know that if I've got something like the PMGSY, the Pradhan Mantri Gram Sadak Yojana, the PMGSY allows me to build roads. But if I've got a bridge that I need on that road, PMGSY doesn't allow me to build a bridge. So if I'm Jharkhand, I'm stuck, I don't have the money. If I'm Gujarat, I have created the fiscal space to supplement those central sector and centrally sponsored schemes with state level schemes which now enable me to build that road. Now this template is a template that every state should be adopting. Before someone asks me about Bihar, it's early days for Bihar, because Bihar, and again let me make this point about Gujarat. Initially when you reform, big bang growth rates of 10% plus are possible. Then it plateaus off. I personally do not think that it is possible for Gujarat to sustain a GSDP growth rate of 10%. 8.5%, yes, not 10%. Final question, the provocative one. All this, who is responsible? Now, this is a very binary kind of thing. Why does it have to be 0 and 1? I do not think anything is actually 0 and 1. There are several reasons why Gujarat has certain advantages. Geography, distrust over the government, private entrepreneurship, healthy tradition of Panchayati Raj, geographical proximity to ports, geographical fortune, being fortunate geographically in the sense of being located on the DMC and the freight corridor, all of that is true. But many of the things that are executive and bureaucratic in nature, I personally think are directly attributable to the present Chief Minister. Had it not been for the present Chief Minister, the executive part of it and the bureaucratic part of it would not have happened. Had it not been for the present Chief Minister, I do not think this sense of pride in everyone I met in Gujarat would have happened. Everyone in Gujarat I met, and I'm not talking about the government, they fell over backwards to tell me about the wonderful things that were happening with their lives. So when I went on a visit to the dams, my image of the dams before going there was what? Deprived area full of mosquitoes. Who was there? Well, I went there. And I met people, not with government people with me alone. I met people through the Panchayat. And I asked them, what are your problems? I thought the schools are not there. Doctors are not there, PhDs. They said, if you have a link with the government, if you had any connection with the government, will you tell them that can the check dams be 11 meters tall? I said, what? I was seated like this. I almost fell off my chair. I said, what? Is that all you want? Check dams 11 meters tall? He said, yes. I said, why? They said, well, the present check dams are only allowed to be 2 meters tall, and we can only grow 2 crops. I said, 2 crops? You grow 2 crops? Yeah, we grow 2 crops. You can grow 3 crops with check dams that are 11 meters high. I said, I must see these crops. Dang! I go to the dams, and what do I see? I see these nets all over the place. These nets that horticultural crops are covered with, what do the nets do? They keep off insects, they prevent evaporation, and they reduce water usage by anything up to 25%. So I said, where do you buy these nets from? Oh, there is an NGO which has subsidized us this, that and the other. So I said, not the government. No, there are NGOs all over the place. So I went to meet the NGOs. What do the NGOs say? Well, look, we've got a problem with tractors. We don't have tractors. So what have we done? We've got these 10 guys together to pool in. We've given them a loan to buy a tractor. They repay the loan by leasing out that tractor to villages all over. So all over the dams I saw this diversification of agriculture happening, this animal husbandry happening. Ask them, where do you market all of this? They don't sell it in Ahmedabad, too far. Across the border, you sell it in Maharashtra. The roads have done that. But I digress. So this pride, this sense of pride, this attempt to improve your life, all of this I think is directly attributable. And I think we would be less than honest, and I've said this outside also, if we don't acknowledge that. So if it is malnutrition, it is all because of him. If it is growth, oh, it's because of the history. And that seems to be somewhat illogical. Let me end there.
Very much for such a clear and erudite speech which explained the background stories, the factors that were either grand or minuscule were the architect of the Gujarat growth story. As we have differentiated between growth and development. So this explains why Gujarat development is important, because it is not